September 22nd, 1943. Kaafjord, deep inside a heavily defended Arctic anchorage in northern Norway. Ringed by anti-submarine nets, minefields, and patrol boats, sits the Tirpitz, sister ship to the Bismarck, the single most powerful battleship in the German Navy and the one ship the Royal Navy fears more than any other afloat. Approaching her, submerged, is a vessel roughly 50 feet long, barely large enough for a crew of 4 men to work standing up, carrying no torpedoes and almost no weapons of its own. Her entire offensive power consists of 2 steel canisters bolted to her sides, each holding 2 tons of amatol explosive, meant to be dropped directly onto the seabed underneath the target and set off on a time fuse. To get here, this miniature submarine has been towed nearly 1,000 miles across the North Sea behind a full-size submarine, through minefields and past German air patrols, changing crews partway through the voyage. In the next few hours, this tiny vessel and 1 sister craft will do something no aircraft, battleship, or full-size submarine has yet managed. They will put Tirpitz out of action for the best part of a year. This is the story of Operation Source and the X-craft raid on the Tirpitz. By 1943, Tirpitz had become, in Winston Churchill's own words, one of the primary preoccupations of the entire war at sea, despite having fired barely a shot at an Atlantic convoy. Simply by existing, fully operational, and based in a Norwegian fjord within striking distance of the convoy routes to Russia, she forced the Royal Navy to keep capital ships, aircraft carriers, and entire escort groups tied down watching her, on the chance she might sortie. Conventional attempts to deal with her had already failed. Aerial bombing raids struggled to reach her heavily defended anchorage with enough accuracy or payload to cripple a ship of her size, and no surface force could realistically fight its way into a fjord that well defended without suffering crippling losses of its own. The Admiralty needed a way to strike her that did not require getting past her guns, her escorts, or her air cover in any conventional sense. It needed a weapon small enough and quiet enough to simply go underneath all of it. The answer, on paper, looked almost absurd. Since 1942, the Royal Navy had been developing X-craft, midget submarines roughly 51 feet long and 30 tons submerged, crewed by 4 men working in conditions closer to a large metal drainpipe than a warship, with barely enough room to lie flat, let alone stand. They carried no periscope-guided torpedoes and no deck gun. Their entire weapon system was a pair of explosive charges slung along their hull, designed to be released directly onto the seabed beneath an anchored target and detonated hours later on a time fuse once the midget submarine and her crew were, ideally, long gone. Getting these tiny, short-ranged craft anywhere near northern Norway meant towing them the entire distance behind full-sized submarines, a passage of roughly 1,000 miles across open mined and patrolled water, with a passage crew handling the tow and an entirely separate operational crew taking over only for the final approach and attack. To keep the assault team fresh for the most dangerous phase of the mission, 6 X-craft set out in September 1943, targeting 3 of Germany's most powerful warships simultaneously. Tirpitz and Scharnhorst, both anchored in Kaafjord, and the older pocket battleship Lutzow nearby in Longefjord. The operation began losing ships before it even reached its targets. X-9, under tow across the North Sea, parted from her towing submarine and was never seen again, lost with her entire passage crew before the operational crew had even taken over. X-8, bound for Lutzow, suffered a cascading series of mechanical failures, including one of her own explosive side charges detonating prematurely, forcing her crew to scuttle her and abandon the attack entirely. Of the 6 boats that set out, only 3, X5, X6, and X7, all assigned to Tirpitz specifically, remained in any condition to press on into one of the most heavily defended anchorages in the entire German Navy. If you're finding this account of just how small a weapon it took to cripple Germany's most powerful battleship interesting, subscribing helps the channel keep telling stories like this properly. Getting into Kaafjord meant physically penetrating a boom of anti-torpedo netting strung across the fjord's entrance, a barrier specifically designed to stop exactly this kind of attack. X6, commanded by Lieutenant Donald Cameron, was already in poor shape by the time she reached the net, her periscope partially flooded and unreliable, and one of her own explosive charges taking on water. Cameron chose to press on regardless, following what appeared to be a gap in the netting, likely opened briefly for a passing surface vessel, and got his boat through into the anchorage itself. Once inside, further problems left her effectively blind and listing badly to starboard, forcing Cameron to navigate the final approach largely by dead reckoning and gyroscope alone, rather than visual bearings. Lieutenant Basil Place's X7 had a rougher passage still, becoming entangled in the anti-torpedo netting more than once and forced deep by a passing German picket boat before finally breaking through and beginning her own approach on the battleship. Both boats managed to work their way beneath Tirpitz's hull and release their explosive charges directly under her keel. Set on delayed fuses to allow time for at least some chance of escape, neither boat had much chance left by that point. X6, crippled and unable to dive properly, was spotted on the surface inside the anchorage, but initially mistaken by German lookouts for wreckage or debris rather than an attacking vessel, buying Cameron just enough time to finish positioning his charges before the deception collapsed. With escape clearly impossible, Cameron scuttled X6 and surrendered with his crew, who were taken aboard Tirpitz herself as prisoners, an almost surreal detail. The men who had just placed 4 tons of explosive beneath the ship were now standing on her deck as captives while the fuses ran down beneath them. X7 was also detected and damaged trying to withdraw, becoming fouled again in the defensive netting. 2 of her crew, Sub-Lieutenant Whittam and Engine Room Artificer Whiteley, did not survive, while Place managed to escape the sinking boat and was also taken prisoner. X5, the third boat committed to the attack, was lost with her entire crew, in circumstances that remain unclear to this day, possibly sunk by Tirpitz's own gunfire as she attempted her approach. At around 8:12 that morning, the charges detonated beneath Tirpitz's hull. The explosion did not sink her, but it tore through her from below with devastating effect, buckling hull plating across a huge stretch of her keel, flooding multiple compartments, wrecking turbine and generator machinery, and in one particularly violent detail, lifting an entire main gun turret bodily off its mountings before it settled back down, wrecked and unusable. Tirpitz, Germany's most powerful surviving capital ship, was left unable to move under her own power and effectively out of the war for months. Repairs dragged on until April 1944, at which point a Fleet Air Arm strike, Operation Tungsten, caught her again before sea trials could even resume, adding a further 2 months of repair time on top of what the X-craft had already achieved. In total, of the 4 operational crew aboard X6 and X7 who actually carried out the attack, all survived as prisoners of war. Across the wider operation, 9 men were killed and 6 captured, an extraordinarily light cost set against the damage inflicted on one of the most powerful warships in the world. Lieutenants Donald Cameron and Basil Place were both awarded the Victoria Cross for the attack, recognizing what the official citation called a most daring and successful action against a heavily defended target that no other branch of the armed forces had yet managed to touch. Engine Room Artificer Goddard of X6 received the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal, the only one awarded for the entire operation, for keeping X6's failing machinery running long enough to complete the approach at all. Tirpitz herself never fully recovered her role as a roving Atlantic threat after Operation Source. She limped through further repairs and further air attacks over the following year, before finally being destroyed at anchor in November 1944 by RAF heavy bombers dropping tallboy bombs in an anchorage she had, by that point, barely left in over a year. Nothing about a 51-foot midget submarine, barely large enough for 4 men to work inside, suggested it belonged anywhere near the most powerful battleship afloat. Tirpitz had guns, armor, escorts, minefields, and netting specifically built to stop exactly this kind of approach, and on paper, none of it should have left room for a vessel this small to get anywhere close. What actually decided the outcome was a handful of men willing to keep pressing forward through flooded periscopes, tangled netting, and boats already failing around them, place their charges regardless, and accept that getting back out was very likely not going to happen. 4 tons of explosive, delivered by hand from directly beneath the hull, did more lasting damage to Tirpitz in a single morning than any bombing raid had managed in the 2 years before it.